2013. And this plastic brick is the PlayStation 4. It's been about 7 years since the release of the PlayStation 3, so it's about high time for a new console. There's the typical bluster and overpromise of a brand new console, but really no one gives a shit until there's some names thrown around. There are some rather traditional choices, but little did anybody in that crowd or even anybody on that stage know that a fairly unassuming racing game made by MotorStorm's own Evolution Studios would not only come to be known as one of the best racing games of the coming generation, but would also become one of its biggest failures. After consistently creating in the same series for almost a full generation, they were ready to set their sights on a new sun beaming across the horizon. The PlayStation 3 had been notorious for developers. Evo, much like countless other developers, had to learn everything as they went along. It led to a great deal of innovation, at the very least technically, but there was unfortunately a thinness in content for the first MotorStorm. Nevertheless, the game was a success, proving that Evo were a more than capable developer. By the end of their tenure with the MotorStorm series, they had pushed the system to its absolute limits. Ironically enough, their new game would actually in fact be older than MotorStorm in some respects, dating all the way back to 2004. These early PlayStation 3 hardware tests with their well-modeled Lotus Elise are simply a simple reminder that Evo's output on the PlayStation 3 could have been very different indeed. I have a strong infatuation with the MotorStorm series, and despite the fact it didn't end well.
Oh, fuck. I was still a lover, man.
Right. But I think it's time to make something new, and that's certainly what they thought. And perhaps there's no greater time to breathe life into an old idea. A near decade no less after its original test, and that yellow Lotus Elise was nowhere to be seen. The only thing left was the title, DRIVECLUB. The new generation of PlayStation officially began in November of 2013, and despite originally being announced as a launch title for the PS4, Sony's flagship racer that was brand new onto the racing game scene was nowhere in sight. That meant for anyone buying the PlayStation 4 on day one, the only racing game available was Need for Speed Rivals. Over the first year of the PS4's release, things were off to a very sluggish start. Many of the releases were made fun of, rightfully so, for simply being underdeveloped remasters of PlayStation 3 games. However, more of a problem than that was that Sony was now banking on the safe ubiquity of what I'll come to call story-based action-adventure games. Now that's a very vague descriptor, sure, but one look at the library of PlayStation 4 games, well, there's a permeating case of fucking deja vu. Everything has to be so fucking dour, like they're all trying to win an Emmy. More than ever, there was a need for some seemingly simple fun. As the holiday season was fast approaching, Xbox already had two types of excellent Forza games, Motorsport being a grounded and tunable track racer, and Horizon being an open-world arcade joyride. Meanwhile, PlayStation didn't have anything. No new next-gen Gran Turismo, and no flagship. That meant for players looking for a more casual experience on the PS4, well, as always, DRIVECLUB has to be good. After numerous delays and pushed far beyond the timescale of being known as a simple launch title, in October 2014, there was finally a glimpse of PlayStation's racing game future. For whatever the good or bad can be said about DRIVECLUB, I think it's a fundamentally misleading game, and for all the right reasons. Not like Spec Ops The Line or wow, fucking comparison. No, where DRIVECLUB is misleading is within its depth. Pretty as the game is, and it is pretty, looks can certainly be deceiving, because from the outside, depending on who's asked, this can either look like a simple weekend racer or a stone-faced simulator. Most didn't consider was that it would end up being a balance between the two. Although DRIVECLUB is certainly not an off-road racer, it feels, at least in terms of design ethos, like a return to Evo's first series, the WRC. It's definitely more in spirit than it is literal, but I think it ties into something larger that most racing games miss. The Need for Speed series is perhaps one of the best examples of an emotional roller coaster. There are moonshot highs, and there are ditch-digging lows. It's a series with a staggering amount of variety, but there's a problem that permeates all of it. Good idea? Fucked it up. There's this underlying feeling that they can never fully devote to a concept beyond one game, that whatever comes next will be so different, whatever lessons were learned will be irrelevant. And this might seem like I'm picking on the Need for Speed series, and yeah, I am. But bullying Need for Speed is not my goal here. I'm using the series as an example to preface my next point about this piece of shit. MotorStorm RC is bad. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. I think it's shit. But for whatever little it is worth, in more ways than one, this was a firm indication of the future, more than a consideration of the past. Leaderboards and breezy player-based competitions, all of that has been expanded into the scope of a much larger game. Community-based racing, progression not even fully based on winning, but instead interaction. And although this game really drop-kicks the fucking player right into the deep end, this introduction basically summarizes everything about the game. Unforgiving racing and unpredictable tracks, face-offs and point counters and star ratings, specific aspects like weather and time affecting that of the gameplay. It's overwhelming and fun. This game isn't about winning every race, it's about chipping away at everything around it. What ultimately led to this game's downfall wasn't entirely unexpected, but I can assuredly say one aspect that was never going to be a detriment is the racing. On the surface, DRIVECLUB doesn't necessarily appear as a particularly original game, but of course, looks can be deceiving. No, purely in terms of design, I've always thought of it more of something like Grid, grounded in its overall nature, but never too far away from the arcade. Another game that comes to mind a lot is Bizarre Creations' Project Gotham Racing series. Once again, not entirely unrealistic, but definitely not stretching as far out as something like, well, Wipeout. Whatever realistic looking visuals between these two, these are certainly arcade racing games first. Evo's previous series was squared purely in the center of arcade action racing. As expected, these games were not realistic, right down the line in their own particular extremity. What started as a simple bare-knuckle brawl in the desert ended in a desperate rampage for a burning city. These were 4 excellent games, and by their conclusion, Evo had exhausted their own concept. This makes DRIVECLUB an almost back-to-basics affair, and in the process, a very pure racing experience. Fleet is considerable, and the catalog makes itself very clear in the beginning. This is not a game with a catalog of 1,000 where most are needless variants or outright feel the same. The benefit of a smaller roster is that all these vehicles feel distinct, and they will have their own place. Hot hatches, sports, performance, super, hyper, and of course bikes, as well as a particular bonus. One cursory look at that selection and yeah, this really is a car lover's dream. Attention to detail in the sights and sounds of these vehicles is purely staggering. Real-world engine effects or how the character even opens the doors properly. Aesthetically, it's just incredible. It all functions together to make the experience more memorable. The aesthetics of DRIVECLUB will come to be appreciated in due time. But more importantly, of course, the mechanics are the heart of the game. In my first few hours with this game, I really did think that pushing more towards an arcade style, similar to something like Grid, probably would have made the game feel a little bit more sure of itself. That, of course, ended up being a fool's perspective, as DRIVECLUB finds solid ground within its own unique handling model. A Volkswagen Beetle or an Audi R8. Every car in this game is designed with a somewhat accuracy in mind. It's not to say that they're predictable, just that they feel as they should. Gee, I wonder who owned the first Volkswagen Beetle. Cars aimed to be different next to their real-life counterparts. There is, for example, the Curse system, designed to help with acceleration. And despite the fact that this is its own sort of miniature mechanic, it's only seen on the McLaren P1. and its variant. Effectively, only one car in the game. But because the actual car has this unique feature, they put it in the game. The specificity of each car's specifications is about as authentic as it could be in a game like this. I am less of a car fan, more of a Hot Wheels enjoyer, but even I can tell that the Gunpowder Apollo probably shouldn't be this good at drifting. But that is in no way a detriment. In fact, that is just a glimpse at the less serious design of DRIVECLUB. And, in fairness, by the time this particular vehicle is earned, which in this case is very late in the progression anyway, the game has already made itself very clear as to what it is. Whatever realism there may be, it's never secondary to fun. The authentic Prius experience, this is not. When the game embraces more of that arcade nature, it feels all the more better for it. And, well, I think it's time I get something out of the way. 60 frames per second. Do I wish the game could have done it? Yeah. Do I wish they could have implemented an uncapped frame rate for the sake of future-proofing? Yeah, but it's probably best I don't talk about future-proofing with this game just yet. It's a shame, but the game doesn't at all feel slow. The game's been tuned really well for the frame rate. These are tight controls that are very tight fitted. After a few minutes, I always forget the game's not running at 60, and leading on from that, the game really feels good on a pad. Would it feel better on a racing wheel? I don't know, there's bear shit in the woods. I mean, is it really necessary to play a game like fucking Midnight Club LA or something like that on a racing wheel? I mean, is it inherent to the fucking experience? Like, do I really need to play Simpsons Hit and Run on a racing wheel? I mean, I've done it, but I'd rather not do it again. One look at a poo going round in circles without touching the D-pad and... yeah, no thanks. Am I being obtuse? Sure, DRIVECLUB feels pretty fucking good on a racing wheel. My point really is just that it plays really good on a pad. Like, uncharacteristically fucking good. That ease of entry is very handy, because although it's just getting the basics right, this is quite the difficult game. Cars are hefty fuckers, and momentum is very apparent. Blistering at 120 just before hitting a corner, and yeah, that vehicle's only going to keep going one way. That's not to say they're unresponsive, just that they're not un-idiot-proof either. It's also compounded by me turning off all the braking assists. Whatever difficulty is introduced with that, I like a little bit more control over the car, and it certainly makes the drifting more fun. However, I did keep the automatic gears. Whilst they might be a little bit too slow, I think they're fine. They're certainly not noticeable enough that I felt the need to do the shifting myself. Cars in general, even on the lower end, just have a really nice kick to them. Accelerating's really effective, and none of the vehicles seem to struggle getting off the starting line or going around a sharp turn. This game doesn't want to feel slow for long, that's if it feels slow at all. The way the camera does this slight pull away when accelerating, it just adds a little to the quickness. But of course, that speed does come at a price. There's crashing, and yeah, that will happen. But where this mainly comes into effect is with the grip. Understandably, hot hatches ain't gonna have an issue turning left and right angles into child's play. But carry that over to a class of cars that are setting land speed records in Sunday lunch, and well, it's a little bit more tricky. Now I know the statistics are nothing to scoff at, but of course this is all relative. That grip meter is only so high because the top speed meter is gonna be much higher. Game's not bullshitting though, it makes sense, it's balanced. But my god, some of these machines can be a bit of a fucking fight. It's definitely the bowling ball principle, but fuck me is it scary reaching some high speeds in this game. In general, the sense of speed is just fucking beautiful. For once, it isn't just blur and shake. I mean, I fucking love Sleeping Dogs, but it's tastefully done, and as a result, it feels a lot more tangible than most racing games. When cars can be very quick and tracks can be very narrow, it's important to convey that tension to the player. The camera is very reactive, turning slightly when pulling into a wide drift, rising gently above a car when descending a hill. Whilst these are fairly simple techniques, they heighten the experience because they work perfectly in tandem with the gameplay. As these things mainly apply to the third-person camera, of course, I think it's time to mention that this is usually my preferred viewing angle. I like being able to really see the car and the surroundings. But that being said, I think DRIVECLUB has one of the absolute most impressive cockpit views. I usually only prefer playing in a cockpit view in, frankly, non-racing games like a Far Cry or something. And plenty of other racing games have done this kind of stuff before. before, but there's something much like the rest of the game that's been done to make it feel just a little bit more intention. Watching the driver's hands anticipating a gear change, yeah, it fucking does add a surprising amount. But the best one I can think of is one that serves gameplay, as the camera will automatically lean into a corner to help the experience. There's even a rearview mirror that for once is surprisingly detailed, making it fairly useful. But when played without, the game has arrows appear on the screen that do the job well also. And it's little specific elements like this why I think Evo deserves a lot of fucking credit. Because this game is surprisingly malleable to the player's interests. Customization? Tuning? Not really. There is a hardcore handling mode, but I don't find it all that necessary. The game's difficulty is already pretty high anyway, and I think it's actually quite well done. I'm not going to complain about choice, but I would say it undervalues the curated balance a little bit. That aforementioned choice appears most notably, at least to anybody who played the MotorStorm series, in the classes and their unique differences. And it's definitely a valid method of comparison, because some of these it's like pitting a Pomeranian against a fucking Greyhound. But that shit? No. That's fucking surface level. And it's probably not experienced in the game very often anyway. No, what I'm talking about with choice is in specific class differences. I'll go with performance, for example. There's the BMW M3 GTS, and then there's the Spiker C8 Aileron. Now both of these are of course in the same class, but it isn't close. The C8's definitely got better acceleration, sure, but the M3's a better balance. And all of this seems basic and kind of obvious, and yeah, that'd probably be correct. But it is also depth, because there are a handful of choices in performance, and that's only one of the classes. Now, does this mean there are a few turds in the potato patch? Yeah, and whilst the blow of unobtainable vehicles is frankly unavoidable, I think the respectable number at the launch of the game is more than enough. There's definitely a bit of a modern day bias as well, not many classics or retro cars. At least there's no jack of all trades and master of nones in there, but damn, it would have been nice to see some fucking oldies. Could someone pick a particular choice because they like how it looks, or maybe they got some kind of fucking, I don't know, brand loyalty? Sure. And as much as the developers clearly didn't care if people wanted to make that kind of choice, it's really missing a larger one. Despite what I'll call the somersault into the ice bath of the early game, Evo really wants the player to find their car. Climbing the ranks, predictably, gives way to more power, but the game still manages to throw a few oddballs and... Oh, baby. The Wombat fucking Typhoon. The madman only went and did it. And despite the fact this may look like somewhat of a joke vehicle, and maybe it is, there's certainly enough detail to make it stand apart. Let me speed. It's even got its own fucking boost speeder. It's certainly a joy for any MotorStorm fan, and playing it in cockpit mode, it finally realizes that dream of the original MotorStorm pre-rendered trailer. And that's to say absolutely nothing of the concept cars. The cars that don't even technically exist. Cars that without this game would probably only exist in a fucking art book. And this kind of stuff is cutesy and kind of fun. But it's not even the best part, because the best part is that because the vehicles are all so distinct, they need to be learned. The way in which the game presents its events means there's an appreciated variety, but unfortunately the specific choices aren't always given their due. There is a lot of driving the same specific cars, particularly in the DRIVECLUB tour, but when the smaller championships show up, that's when the game really lays its cards on the table. This right here, this specific vehicle progress bar, is the reminder that each vehicle is its own beast. Learning, even mastering just one is the weight of this game's experience. It don't mean variety isn't key to the gameplay. It's just that mastery is respected. DRIVECLUB is truly a game where I could constantly feeling myself getting better at every turn. Getting better at every turn, eh? I think it's about time I mentioned something. And that is its drifting. I don't know if I've ever played a game where the fucking drifting felt just so good. Turning the matchbox sideways, yeah, got it. But wow, is it fun, and satisfying, and kind of fucking useful. Flicking the back end up, keeping the speed up, and just barely touching that analog stick. It's like fucking whittling or something. And they knew this shit was fucking Gucci, because there's a fucking event just for drifting in this game. And I'm glad they did, because in my time of scraping the walls and scraping everybody else, drifting gave a fuck up like me the chance to be Cinderella at the ball. What the fuck? I'm gonna talk about the AI now, and these cats don't fuck around. They're reasonably aggressive, nudging the player out the way, and DRIVECLUB's already a difficult game, so there isn't much room for failure. The AI rubber banding is mostly pretty subtle. Sometimes it feels like the AI gets a bit more of a kick out of the vehicles in the straightaways, but generally I think the rubber banding is actually quite well done. They're not unfair, they're just not pushovers either. It's a good balance, and I think it keeps the game fresh. The AI can also be used for a very useful feature: streamlining, drafting, and it ends up being quite a big part of the gameplay. Definitely a useful tool and necessary to pass in the AI races, but of course, they can use it as well, and I got no problem with that. It keeps me on my toes. The AI doesn't really drift, so it's nice that there's something to make them a little bit more mechanically deep. Drafting is fine, but sitting behind the vehicles, there's an issue. An issue that becomes quite noticeable quite quickly. I've already stated how they are very good at being aggressive, and that is definitely true, but there is one thing they're better at. It's the opposite. It's defense. These drivers do not like to move. They're very good at blocking, and they're very good at hogging the track. And this is leading on to a larger point, and there's no easy way to say this. The game wants me to drive like an asshole. The game takes points away for crashing into other races. Yes, the game has fairly severe collision penalties in corners. Yes, but whilst these aspects set a particular tone, they're frankly irrelevant. Because the only way to really pass these guys is to push them out the fucking way. And I'm sure there are so-called racing purists spinning around in their unwashed bucket seats at the very notion that a person like me, an asshole like me, may even exist. But it does not change the fact that this game wants me to be that asshole. Can racing be done cleanly? Oh, sure. I imagine anybody could race cleanly for a sprint track and, well, they'd finish out at around 8th fucking place. But I'm not about that. I'm about fucking rage. And all the smoking gun I fucking need is one look at the demo. And there it is. That's how they played it. That right there is fucking vindication to me. Yeah, that fucking collision penalty. It is a bit whack. A bit goofy, perhaps. Sometimes it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And then other times it's like, slow and steady wins the race. Fuck that. There is, however, another aspect to the cars, or should I say vehicles, that I've only mentioned in passing so far, and that would be the bikes. Whilst DRIVECLUB did have quite a lot of DLC, it had two major expansions in its lifespan. The second was... but the first was bikes, and surprisingly, it's really fucking good. They're definitely doubling down on the more unrealism of the game, but it's certainly a good contrast compared to that of the main game. And thankfully, it is no half-assed attempt. They actually gave it a sincere effort. The first thing that's noticed is that acceleration is a real fight. The front wheel picks up, and they really have to be pushed back into place. They feel powerful. Because the acceleration is so strong, there's a lot less drafting with the bikes. But I don't think it matters too much. It's very fun to push it forward. Absolutely blasting away when finally a line out of a curve, it just never gets old. And because of the obvious smallness of the bikes, it makes the tracks a lot easier to maneuver. I mean, I never got so many fucking clean laps. That isn't to say the aggressive driving or riding method has been changed, as it's still very effective against the AI races. It's just a little less necessary this time around. The main game was very much drift heavy, but the bikes are the opposite. They're wily with a lot of grit. Certainly more maneuverable than I expected, because if anything makes me think of the bowling ball principle, well, it's a fucking crotch rocket. It's definitely strange, but what I do like is how they applied a few more mechanical details to make it more fun. Pushing the rider down to decrease wind resistance, it's certainly kind of realistic if it needs to be. but the game allows for some really fun wheelies that, at the peak, can get really fucking antsy. And again, it's been done in a way that makes these mechanics feel like there's a bit more emphasis than there would be in another game. It's not here to be realistic, it's here to be fun. There isn't any real crashing, it just cuts to an intermission screen, which is fair enough. I don't really want to see someone turn into a human sardine can. The chase camera can be a little bit slow when cornering, which is surprising considering the main game. But if there's one reason I think they made the bike's expansion just to begin with, and this is purely a theory on my end, I think it's just so they could do the cockpit camera. The inertia, the weaving, the head bobbing, it just looks so fucking real. For whatever unrealism of the gameplay, this is probably the most realistic bike riding has ever looked in a game. They put the effort in with the bikes, and it was clearly something they really wanted to do. It wasn't tacked on, it was its own fucking feature, and it's all the better for it. There is one last thing I would like to remark on when it comes to the racing, and that's just how balanced and how polished the game is. The game designers don't handhold, but they don't slap them in the side of the head either. Difficulty spikes? Nada. Just gradually curated challenge. Some of the DLC campaigns are noticeably more difficult than the main, but I don't believe they were meant to be played before the DRIVECLUB tour anyhow. As for polish, I think that kind of speaks for itself. I know it's not exactly a ringing fucking endorsement to complain that there aren't any bugs. I mean, if it's Ubisoft, I'd probably consider it pretty impressive. But this game is just so well refined. The experience is so smooth, and they didn't cut any corners. Well, that makes one of us at least. It really is just one of the best feeling racing games. It finds its niche and it holds that fucking thing down. There are certainly other racing games with more grandiose, more original ideas, but DRIVECLUB does it better than any of them. The epitome of doing a game well, instead of doing it differently, simply for the sake of it. Pushing a car a little too much in a corner, feeling the vibration, feeling it slip. That is an absolute rush. The best thing that could be said about a racing game is that it's fun to race. But that racing, that's only one part of the story. As mentioned numerous times already, the introduction level, whilst a bit of a defend, instantly demonstrates every pillar of the overall game's experience. For better or worse, the first 5 minutes of this game are the extent of hundreds of hours. Definitely a surprise, but certainly not unappreciated. More deep and customizable events are accounted for, but initially it's nice to see just how easy it is to boot up and drive. Hitting the random event is always fun just to see how different they can really get, and it's all helped by the loading being very quick and unintrusive. There is an immediacy to DRIVECLUB that means nothing is ever too far away. Of course, as with most racing games, the races are the flagship. Skirmishes are always fun no matter how many races are on the track. Pushing to the front of the queue or holding down first place. From early to late game, there is always a tension that holds. The races of DRIVECLUB are the most emphasized mode, and for good reason. They're always engaging, and even in the multiple part championship racing events, they continue to be a consistent adventure. Whilst those championships are long, some events are real short. The length vacillates really well in DRIVECLUB.
Looks pretty average size to me.
This leads into the sprints. These are short, intense scrambles. These aren't based on a track's entirety, instead being a carefully cut slice of a specific area. Whilst I didn't interact with the sprints too much, as I tend to like the longer events, they do break up the tradition really well. They are competitive and difficult, and a very good use of the game's possible brevity. Time trials, or as they are occasionally called, hot laps, are the butter to the bread of the game's races. Isolated to the player, these end up being a really good place to learn the tracks, and it's fun to be able to chase the scores whilst doing it. The times can certainly be tough to beat, but of course, that's where the more unconventional racing comes into play. Pulling ahead out of a corner, or seeing that hologram stream past, it's exhilarating. The ghosts can be bullied on the track, so it's purely up to the player to get it right. It's a damn lot of fun, and a really good reminder of DRIVECLUB's mechanical specificity. Beating it on a first try, or going round and round for 40 minutes. It's also worth adding that if a track is a loop, the player is allowed to do it as many times as they want. As bizarre as it sounds, the player is allowed to go at their own pace. Where racing times can really balloon out with the time trials, one place that never happens is with the drifts. These events are short, precise, and a whole heap of fun. As I've already opined, drifting in this game is a lot of fun, so making a whole game around that, fucking A. And once again, when it comes to lessons, these events do a really good job of teaching the player how to drift. It's not even about the cleanness of the slide, it's about the speed at which it's maintained. The difficulty ceiling isn't all that high, but occasionally they'll throw a curveball and it works out quite well. I do think the event could have done with an instant reset feature, but it's fine. I never got tired of these. And that's not even to say they're just drifting. Having a great drift and then spinning out at the end simply isn't good enough, because there are speed zones. Momentum cannot be lost, because the points gained in the speed zones, they're certainly not negligible. And that makes for an event that, whilst usually short, it's always exhilarating. Like the sprints, these are set within specific areas of the tracks instead of the entirety. And so that means, for the most part, they've all been carefully chosen, and they're a good reminder of the player's increasing skill. And this ultimately extends into a bike-exclusive event, skill. For the most part, the bike events are largely the same. The only major difference between the standard game modes is the vehicles being used. Bikes aren't particularly good at power sliding, so it makes sense they wouldn't get their own drift events. But instead of cleaving the thing altogether, it designed a unique alternative. Skill modes play entirely to the bike's mechanics. There are speed gates where a particular miles per hour limit has to be hit, but where this event really stands alone is with its wheelies and stoppies. As the bike's handling can be a bit whack, I will say this event really does fit. It's fun to push this class in ways that usually it wouldn't be able to, or at the very least, it isn't all that beneficial to. Whilst the skill events do have a very sort of stop-start nature, I do think it works. And I especially like that these events can't be cheesed either. The time limits are quite strict, so it keeps the player on their toes. Fun every time. The fact that there is a bike exclusive mode really just goes to show how much they cared about the bikes themselves. This was never some half-assed add-on, it was always a considered effort, and for that they deserve a lot of credit. As implied, the hot laps and the drifts usually ended up being my favorites of the lineup. But that is certainly not to say I didn't enjoy all of these, because I did. They all bring their own unique flavor and they keep the variety fresh. The challenge is accommodating, and more than anything else, they're a lot of fun. So the broad modes are expected, and occasionally not so. But the heart of DRIVECLUB's experience lies with something much smaller. Face-offs, micro-mechanics designed to add more longevity to the in-game events. While it's certainly hard to tell now because of, well, certain circumstances, these used to be absolutely everywhere. Any random event would have numerous face-offs, constant reminders of harder and harder challenges set by players across the globe. And these mechanics are one of the things that kept me coming back to DRIVECLUB time and time again, because it's effortless to beat the scores. I don't mean in terms of difficulty, I mean in terms of playability. It is literally just playing the game. Whatever the player gets out of it is what they want. There are a few kinds: drift zones, speed zones, and racing lanes. Self-explanatory, of course, but they function quite well as a sort of pseudo-tutorial. Adherence to a racing line is probably the best example. In plenty of other games, this is considered to be that of an aid, but here it's become its own mechanic, and that's what makes it more interesting. Is this the ideal way to interface with this track, or reaching a particularly high speed on a straightaway? Is it the game designers saying that this is the ideal speed for a car to be at this particular point? It could be. Or it could be healthy competition. The thing is, it doesn't really matter. Drift face-offs in races are particularly bizarre, as the AI doesn't need to drift. So surely that would put a player at a disadvantage. Or is it a handy tip to keep up speed? On a basic, early game level, these probably could work quite well as guides. But by the later, well, they function more like a sort of digital bench press, an avenue for purely showing off, and that's why the risk-reward works. The game's preset criteria for these are usually pretty easy to beat, but when the player scores were visible, they're always just a little bit out of reach, always lining up somewhat perfectly with the player's skill level. Face-offs, while only small, are one of the reasons DRIVECLUB continues to be so playable. After all, this is considered to be a social racing game, as amorphous as that fucking term may be. But really, that is what DRIVECLUB is exactly about. Community spirit. I mean, the fucking name is a dead giveaway. As much as the multiplayer may only be a memory, it's a gigantic pillar of this game's design. Creating or joining a club sharing challenges between others, pooling together resources so that everyone may thrive. Larger than that though is the fame system that designs to keep competition fresh, showing who's the heavy lifter, who's putting in the time, and who's living off of their efforts whilst doing nothing of their own. Wow, the communist dream. Watching that point counter tick up periodically, just slow enough to be appreciated. And once again, it's a reminder that winning in this game isn't everything. It's simply about playing. Every little aspect feels like it's building to something in DRIVECLUB. And another way that works is the accolade system. In-game milestones based on brands or locations or clean laps. I didn't intend to get a lot. And there's a lot of variety here. And as many as there are, they're all quite long-winded. This is the completionist aspect of the game. There are a few specific treaties based on these accolades, but for the most part they just stand to be a little bit more bragging rights. That is, unless the player wants a LaFerrari, which, yeah, I'd go for that. And that aforementioned completionist feel is present everywhere. Even the DLC tours have their own expansive trophy list. And that is strange, because as timeless as DRIVECLUB can feel, there are definitely areas where it just feels like an early PS4 game. And that makes a lot of sense, because this is an early era PS4 title. And it isn't all that bad either. The auto log system is certainly more unintrusive when it comes to multiplayer functionality, but the social elements in DRIVECLUB are certainly more nuanced. I really appreciate that whilst the game's multiplayer is inherent, it isn't necessary to enjoy the experience. There are a few exclusives that are tied to multiplayer and the clubs, but for the most part everything in the game can be earned through it, and none of the tracks were ever held back through DLC. Does the lack of any DLC tours make the game a little bit difficult to interact with? Sure. Would I have liked to have driven a Lamborghini? Any Lamborghini for that matter? Sure. It's a crying fucking shame and it'll always sting a little, but I do believe the game has enough content on disc to be worth the experience. It's a great game and most of that is intact. The only thing missing is more of it. That being said, what the fuck is this? Like, could they have made this any more fucking obvious that this is a game released in 2014? Like, really, what is that? Ugh. That is fucking gross. I am not calling it hashtag DRIVECLUB every fucking time. It's stupid. And this, the companion app. I'll get it out in the open right away. Shit don't work. The original idea was to always be connected, or a phone, or a tablet, or a Vita. All this effort, and nobody ever considered, I don't want to be always connected. It's bad enough going on a website and getting 100 cookies rammed up my ass, but in fairness, it's a neat enough gimmick. Checking stats on Battlefield 4, yeah, it's fine. But making it this constant, optional annoyance is made more frustrating when pondering, couldn't this time have been better spent? Knowing the game's problems that it had at launch, and I will get to that, it makes that question even more interesting. If the goal was to make a game more involved than any other racing game with its companion app, one look at Need for Speed Network proves, no, it ain't worth it. Time to get back on track. I alluded to the tours earlier, and really they are the best way to experience DRIVECLUB's content, feeling less like an album of mixed quality, and more like a carefully curated playlist. With progression being tied to the power of vehicles, each tour accommodates well and they progress consistently. Harder events being locked behind fairly broad requirements, and oftentimes stars. These are definitely another aspect that makes DRIVECLUB feel so fucking addictive. Once again, winning isn't the focus, at least not all the time anyway. And the stars and the methods of unlocking them really encourage a level of variety in playstyle. Reaching first place is fine enough, but what about reaching a particular speed? What about setting a perfectly clean lap? Pretty difficult to do. With a design like this, it would be very easy for the game to feel somewhat arbitrary, but it never happens. The choice of which ones are worth chasing is always left to the player. To progress, it's only the number of stars that matters, not the specific ones themselves. They're not overly easy, and thankfully they don't all have to be done in one go. There's an openness to the design, and when working in tandem with the face-offs, All of this works well together because it never feels like anything is stepping on anything else's toes. It's another reminder that if a casual experience is wanted, it's there, but there's always a huge amount going on just under the surface. The various modes of DRIVECLUB do an excellent job of holding up their end of the bargain. Be it events or face-offs, they're all additive to the experience, never distracting from the racing, and if anything, only improving the interactivity. Setting a new speed record with a few seconds to spare, seeing the incremental improvements of each particular zone in a drift event. It's satisfying to improve, and the game never stops reminding of that. So whatever the problems, or what simply can't be done anymore, the game's modes will always stand strong. With the feeling of the game and how it is all framed, that leaves where it is set. The tracks of DRIVECLUB represent what is now 3 generations of racing games made by Evolution Studios. After all this time then, it would stand to reason that they definitely know what they're doing, but that doesn't mean there won't be a few surprises along the way. With the MotorStorm series, every particular entry had its own setting. The city or the jungle, a broad definition counterbalanced by each locale being fully explored. It was innovative and typified each game. But DRIVECLUB is a completely different set of wheels. So, instead of one locale, it is now a selection, a handful of countries with numerous areas between them. And Evo's approach to environment here really makes a lot of sense. Setting a game all in one environment, for all the positives, and there were certainly many, does end up defining the game's experience. And simply put, that wouldn't fit the laid-back approach to DRIVECLUB's event interaction. In truth, I believe they've pulled it off, but I was undeniably surprised by just how much is going on here. These are not simple biome changes, and much like the game as a whole, the expectation gets swept away by the delivery. To lay it down, DRIVECLUB is set over the span of 6 separate countries: Canada, Chile, India, Japan, Norway, and Scotland. A unique selection of countries, and I respect that they didn't go for the most obvious choices. There is a purposeful reverence to each country, and a clear appreciation that really helps the distinction further. From the pure reaction to an initial perspective, they're just really pleasant looking. It may just be an adherence to each country's particular climate, but one look at India, and it's a reminder of summer, whilst with Japan, it's much more autumnal. That's not to say it's entirely unrealistic, of course. It's most peculiar for it not to be raining in Scotland. But hey, at least the road signs are accurate. Every country has at least 7 unique tracks each, ranging from carefully laid out racetracks to towering cityscapes, rural highways and outward stretching roads, visually busy towns, and ancient quiet-lived countryside. The variety in visuals and placement speaks for itself, but a moment ago I mentioned that there were 7 tracks at least. That is because most of the tracks in this game are made up of subcategories and variations. One particular track could have several different versions. Port of Vancouver is one area, but from its reversals to outright route changes, it totals out at 6 different versions. This could run the risk of leading to repetition, but the tracks have an intricate enough design that this never becomes a problem. And this is to say nothing of the weather and time effects. The simple showers are negligible, but the heaviest of rain, it's unceasing and aggressive. Visibility becomes noticeably harsher, almost too much so. But more than that, the vehicles begin to slip on the wet tarmac. Both the visual and gameplay aspects of the rain really contribute to the difficulty, deepening the experience and making the game more dynamic. Time can pass quickly, really quickly. I don't mean it in the wow, so profound kind of way. I mean literally time passes really fucking fast in this game. An entire day and night cycle can go by in a few minutes. Fully adaptable lighting was originally shown in Pacific Rift, but here it's expanded not only for looks. Day and night certainly changes the tone, but of course it's the gameplay where this is heavily changed. Racing in the dark is no easy feat, and when combined with that aforementioned heavy rain, the two compound each other for a very memorable challenge. All of this may seem a little obvious, and it is, but it's also rare. Rare for a racing game to put the screws to the player so violently. After MotorStorm's mud and water, it's Shouldn't be a surprise the environments become a fight, but that highlights something. Terrain, at least under the vehicle, is almost always a road. The occasional cobble path or dirt byway might add some extra vibration, but it doesn't convince me that they handle all that much differently. It is a little limiting, but the routes are definitely the focus. That isn't to say there aren't a decent number of hills and bumps in the tracks either, which become a lot more noticeable with the faster vehicles. Tracks are for the most part very linear. Where I suppose this changes is when leaving the track, where steering locks and the car slows and slides. A firm reminder that this is not where the vehicle is meant to be. I'd like to say this doesn't happen often, but of course, this is me. My inadequacies aside, the game doesn't have any real track obstacles, except maybe the track itself. The game compensates, strangely enough, by making the tracks much more narrow. It's an adequate design, and for the most part it isn't all that bad. But that narrowness, compounded with the AI, does make passing very difficult sometimes. One-lap races can really be a struggle. On the track Salade de this one, I find the loop to be a little too short, and I can never seem to make any progress against other races. When there's only one shot to do this, it becomes needlessly tough. When tracks widen, the somewhat tactless free-for-all of standard racing, instead, more methodical, patient racing is rewarded in these moments. Of course, that's not me. And it's not most of the game anyway. That is also to say that my, I'll call it adventurous driving style has gotten me into a bit of bother. The game has some pretty ridiculous corner penalties, and sometimes they can be very inconsistent. It makes sense not to encourage hooliganism, but do I regret my actions? No. One of the reasons I noticed this is because I just wish the game didn't have so many invisible walls, making the tracks feel a little bit more boxed in than they should, especially when driving in the countryside. Like sometimes it would just be fun to fly.
Lord help me, I can't change.
When tracks snake and weave, the challenge is really entertaining. Sure, the minimap does a lot of the heavy lifting, but even without it, there are some useful cornering flags. And the minimap doesn't exactly visualize elevation either. One quirk that does come to mind is turning a corner with a slight incline always seems to be out of an even-handed chance whether or not the vehicle spins out or not. It ain't that bad though, and finding a consistent drifting line is a feeling so good that it washes away the rest of the track's problems. This is part of the larger aspect of learning each track. Some are simple, but most have a level of unpredictability, and the player's learned experience is even more necessary because there is no rewind. A small mistake and the whole race is foobar. In Evo's previous series Motorstorm, mechanics were always instantaneous, or at the very least, always in reach. With DRIVECLUB, no drifting zone on the track likely means there is no drifting within that particular event. The sense of competition blocks a little freedom. That's certainly what it looks like, but it isn't entirely true. A driver with enough experience behind the wheel or the handlebars, or even one who's just willing to take the risk, it's no longer a factor. It's a very basic form of player expression, and thankfully the game usually doesn't discourage it. I mention this to serve a point. I'm always disappointed to see a game set a track in a unique country, only to find it's another sparse, concrete racetrack with very little going on. That may sound like a dumb shit thing to say, but dumb shit coming from me is a bit like a darts player letting out a fart right before scoring an 180. It's not entirely unexpected. Long-winded and misguided point aside, because the track variety is so strong elsewhere in DRIVECLUB, for once, the racing tracks actually stood out. They ended up being a pleasant change of pace. Not that I got sick of any of the other tracks or anything. It's just surprising that I got along as well as I did with these particular circuits. Even simple loops are given just enough spontaneity to stand out. Lock, do-ick, do-itch. God, I thought the Scots were considered drunks. Layout certainly looks basic enough. But there are micro turns, making sure any straight stretch of road never stays too straight for long. There are also some minor climbs and descents, decent enough hills that become very dangerous for the faster vehicles. There's a large bank, a narrow bridge, and even before that, a place where the player needs to double back on themselves. A first lap of this is stressful, a second is healthily competitive, and a third is just practice. As much as lap-based racing is certainly the focus and definitely a staple, what about a once-over? Whilst I'd usually call these sprint tracks, the name was taken in DRIVECLUB, so I'll simply call them one-take tracks. Self-explanatory really. No matter how the track may wind, it's a straight shot to the exit. Not having to loop back on every track is really cool. Seeing the team just have fun designing something unique. MotorStorm Apocalypse Best Tracks used this design to great effect. There's no collapsing buildings in DRIVECLUB, so it is a little less dramatic, but there's far more usage here than there ever was in MotorStorm. These tracks are reasonably long, and they end up feeling more desperate. When there's only one shot to get it right, the tension is immediately elevated. More chances are taken, and every opportunity is a necessity. As much as I do like perfecting a run on a well-made loop, I gotta admit, the layouts seem more diverse, and the constantly aforementioned unpredictability is alive and well. Appreciating the tracks is easy, because there's quality at every turn. I love Ashi. It's vibrant and dense, with its short, winding roads. It's narrow in places, but definitely long enough in others to punch it. As tightly constructed as it is, it's incredible to think that there are variants on top of this, and quite a few of them no less. This template embodies the best aspects of DRIVECLUB's tracks. On reverse, where Ashi is a fairly enclosed track, the mountainside drifting capabilities and the forward stretching tunnels define the downhill sprinting of Nakasando. It's varied in elevation and cornering, and it's a longer track to boot. That is, of course, unless the reversal's driven, in which case it changes once again. And as complicated as these must have been to make, that's without even referring to the fact of reality. Many of these tracks are based on real map data. Seen here is Oliver's Landing, for the sake of example. And one cursory look, yeah, this is the same fucking place. Looking a bit deeper, however, just because it's accurate, doesn't mean it'll be fun. As much as I am sure the technology was a big help, the quality of what is on display here is much more relevant to the talent of those involved. The tracks are authentic, not outright realistic. The picking their battles approach has been an unreserved success. These don't feel like just backdrops. They feel like actual, tangible places. There is so much care and personality on display, demonstrated through both looks and feel. Specifically, the tracks aren't defined by setting. It's not as simple as Chile being rural or Norway being urban, for example. Rather, there's a strong variety within tracks across the broadness of the separate countries. To put it simply, it isn't the countries that set the tracks apart, it's the designs themselves. If anything, the aesthetics of each track stand out purely for separate reasons, and for once, it's perfectly cool. Usually, this form of visuals versus layout would lead to an incohesive design, but the layouts, for the most part, are stellar, so the visuals are only additive. The balance between look and feel is certainly not an easy one. I shouldn't be surprised, because they've done it before, and they've done it really fucking well. But I am surprised that they didn't just do it with one, they did it with 6. They didn't just make them play well, they made them deep. The tracks are sharp, inspired, and expansive. It is a fantastic curation, worthy of the elegant machines perusing through it. With the free pillars of gameplay being strongly established, it will soon be time to lay out the aesthetics and presentation of DRIVECLUB. But there are a few last stops before that can happen. A few irksome issues, persistent problems, and things that, for lack of a better term, are detriments. To begin, it is probably best to start where the game began. The release of DRIVECLUB was by no means clean. I do believe that many of the reviews at the time were certainly expecting a little bit too much. There was the predictable console war bullshit, which Sony themselves certainly didn't help with that narrative. Despite the presence of some fairly positive reviews, for the most part it certainly seemed like there was a harshness when talking about the game. That, that being said, there is simply no easy way to put it. The launch of DRIVECLUB was fucking awful. Even a launch as notoriously bad as Test Drive Unlimited 2 wasn't even nearly this bad. The multiplayer being such a big facet of the game, and it not being there at all, it goes without saying that this game was almost dead on arrival. The panic that set in from those involved to get this game in a passable fashion meant there was an awful lot of time when this game really looked to be floundering. But even in this state, this frankly unacceptable state, there had still been numerous delays before this point. The excuses just weren't enough, and the benefit of the doubt had long since passed. To make matters noticeably worse, there is also...
On October 10th in the UK, you have to go to the PlayStation Store, pick up DRIVECLUB as a PlayStation Plus user for free.
This didn't happen. And I'm not picking on Russia or anybody else for that matter, but shit like this really doesn't help. The PlayStation Plus edition is a pretty neat idea, an extended demo for the game. Let people get their claws into it without putting any money down. In another world, imagining the PS Plus edition functioning as a Gran Turismo 5 prologue to the PS4, that idea is fascinating. But this version, this edition of the game, did not come out on the day of release. It came out halfway through 2015. By this point, there have been numerous paid DLC packs released, so it made this version of the game look a bit more like it was placating an audience that was no longer there. It doesn't help that outside of the multiplayer, DRIVECLUB is a purely single-player effort, as there is no split screen.
We've been through this before.
It's very disappointing, and frankly, I think they should know better. In any other genre of game, I think it's a negligible feature. But when it comes to racing games, I don't even consider it a feature, I consider it a necessity. I am sure this is down to technical limitations, which would be a fairly acceptable excuse if the rest of the game didn't feel like it wasn't willing to sacrifice visual fidelity for playability. The game plays very well, yeah. The game is gorgeous, there is no doubt about it. But with a 60 FPS ceiling and a lower resolution, that would have been really neat. Because even though a PS4 definitely could not handle this shit, a future generation will always be able to. It doesn't sink the experience for me, and frankly, none of the detriments of DRIVECLUB really do. Most of the experience fits together really well. But occasionally there's this feeling of an uneasy looseness. Whilst vehicles are somewhat personalized, at least in gameplay, due to player choice, the game does lack expression, limited customization, the lack of a true garage. There isn't a lot for the player to define their experience, at least from a superficial standard. Finding a favorite vehicle is a joy, and learning each track configuration is gratifying. This takes precedent over that previously mentioned standard, as it absolutely should. But the game lacks just a little bit more beyond that. Having a unique club or a specialized livery is fine, but it is overarching and it doesn't feel specific to the player. The closest that comes to that is putting badges on the side of a vehicle, but I've never been all that interested in showing off the bragging rights of a later game achievement. And that makes something a little bit more noticeable, something a little larger, because although it could be said that collecting all the stars or all the vehicles or all the badges is some kind of end goal, there really is no end goal. Even I find that to be somewhat of a superfluous criticism, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a validity to it. However, the nature of the game is one that I certainly do appreciate, especially considering Evo's past. DRIVECLUB fixes a lot of the problems that Motorstorm Apocalypse had with its multiplayer unlocks. Again, that locked entire vehicles and customization behind multiplayer. And whilst DRIVECLUB does have a few club exclusives, the ubiquitous feel of DRIVECLUB does wonders for longevity and that completionist feel. The progression is sound, and it always feels like something like a new vehicle is never too far away. It's engaging and engrossing. However, there are no two ways around it. The servers being gone for DRIVECLUB has left a severely stripped game. The Season Pass, and more broadly speaking DLC plan, were really advanced. There was a lot of content releasing quite often. The prices were good and it was worth the value. It's a shame then when seeing all the grayed out content, as it simply makes the game feel much more empty than it actually is. It's unceasingly jarring, and every single corner of this game has a blatant reminder of an inaccessible multiplayer. With the only appearance of certain car brands, and the entirety of the bikes expansion, It goes a long way when fans recommend the game, with the game itself and the overbearing caveat sat right next to it. Multiplayer is the heart of the game. Even if that isn't true, at the very least, it's an entire half of it. The name itself is an attestation of that, but regardless, it's simply another reminder that its loss is heavy. And unfortunately, broadly speaking, it's unavoidable due to time. But it wasn't just the servers being taken down, because, as was implied, the DLC was taken away too. And from a purely business standpoint, it is understandable. Vehicle licenses are incredibly hefty to keep going. The only licenses that cost more are for songs. But there is a point to be acknowledged here. Before the server outage and the DLC being taken off of the store, they could have made the choice to make that DLC free. This, like most of the game's issues, is completely on the multi-billion-dollar corporation behind the game, Sony. I'm certainly not a big fan of theirs already, considering their trigger-happy approach to underperforming games. Lord knows that part of the story only gets worse as going along. They simply erected the middle finger and whispered, "Fuck you." And it's certainly frustrating, but what bothers me more is the potential. I'm not talking about the potential of the game itself. That'll get quite granular and I will get to it. What I'm talking about is the plans for DLC. It was already confirmed that there were plans for more Motorstorm vehicles to be added, but there must have been more ambition beyond what was seen. That well-itemized DLC pass was not just a declaration of content, but an indication of a future. They wanted to do more. Much more. And only they know what that could have been. It's fun to imagine, but the biggest missed opportunity wasn't even their own. It was the reception to the game. The launch was awful, but Evo's commitment kept the development strong. What Gaming Press certainly didn't afford them was the benefit of the doubt. Assassin's Creed Unity and The Division were two games that were released in comparably shitty states, maybe even more so. Sacre Bleu, what do these two games have in common? Both of these games managed to turn it around, and they were lauded for it. The Drive Club? Not so much. I put about as much faith in the mainstream gaming press as I do in the family dog. But the dog can lick his own bollocks, so he's got something like, what's that word? Oh yeah. Talent. Because what those journos missed was that there was nothing to turn around for Drive Club. The game was always good. The foundation of the game was always good. When the devs got everything working, there was nothing to be improved. That foundation was what the game always was. I concede it's not exactly the most profound thing in the world. Every game has an intention and a delivery. The difference is that Drive Club's intention and delivery, at least by the end of it, was what they always intended. Saying the game was good now was simply forgetting what was already there. The majority of the game's issues were factors outside of it. The experience in parts doesn't feel complete, but the game itself is mostly excellent. Taking the game for what it is in inherent retrospect merely demonstrates that the detriments were never enough to hold the true experience down. So, I think I've well established that I enjoy this game quite a bit. But what about something I don't? What about something that brings me a level of discomfort most games could only imagine? That at least by 2016's standard, was a reality most virtual. Are
you ready for this shit?
Oh, fuck. A side hustle that could give any recovering alcoholic the shakes. Well, the reality might be virtual, but the motion sickness sure fucking isn't. For nothing else, Drive Club VR is the closest gaming experience I've had to drink driving. I'll say it's impressive how this bulbous monstrosity somehow managed to be two fucking kinds of eyesore. They cheaped out, and it's clear. Having LEDs that need to be picked up by a camera that never seems to fucking sit straight. It's uncomfortable, and it's unresponsive. The PlayStation brand is no stranger to shit gimmicks, but this might actually take the cake for being the shittiest one. The game thankfully doesn't use the glowing dildos, instead adhering to the game's standard of a racing wheel or a gamepad. With the needlessly tedious setup out of the way, it's time to strap in. And with my gourd slowly being squashed and the resolution resembling that of a tiled bathroom wall, I'm starting to regret my decision to boot up this horseshit. And holy Toledo if the first impression of DRIVECLUB isn't the word fucking hideous. One of the best looking games of the generation reduced to this soupy looking nightmare. The visuals really took a bonk to hit the frame rate target. This is the closest thing to playing at the aforementioned 60 frames a second. Yeah, I'm starting to think it wasn't worth it. Despite that though, the rest of the experience is largely the same. The gameplay is smooth without any real change, and the audio of course is still very strong, perhaps even being slightly more so as the 3D audio comes into effect. The blurry glaucomic tunnel vision of the VR headset really doesn't help, but my god the environments have suffered. That being said, where this game really impresses is when analysing the cars. It never really feels like I'm sat in a real car, but hey, some of this detail is staggering. The cars are largely unaffected by the technical downgrades, and that was a fucking good choice to make. In the standard game, it's fairly difficult to actually just look around a vehicle and really take it all in. But here it ended up holding the experience for me. All the little knobs and the interior stitching, it's just fucking fantastic to look at. Wow, it's like I'm really sat in a... Are these my hands? I don't suppose it matters when I have no arms! And this is where the aforementioned dissonance comes in again, because this is just unsettling no matter how they try to do it. Even having the steering wheel turn on its own might have been a better decision, because this makes me just feel like I'm in an episode of fucking Goosebumps. But of course, this is all somewhat superfluous. How does the game play? The sense of speed is all gone. I can't blame it because motion sickness was of course a consideration, and definitely one of mine. But it is really easy to gauge distance, and it makes the gameplay a little bit more consistent. The difficulty of the AI races seems to have been toned down a little bit, and they are easier to deal with. The tracks aren't any different, and the modes are all the same. For whatever reason, DRIVECLUB VR does have its own progression compared to the standard, but I can never see myself playing this for very long anyway. The lack of feeling when it comes to speed has brought up a big issue though. Because a car never feels like it's going that fast, it's hard to gauge when to turn into a corner. I crashed a lot in DRIVECLUB VR, and for once, I'm not actually blaming myself. For the most part though, I'll be honest, it does play well, and that is all because of the game it is based upon. I think PSVR is some gimmicky bullshit, but I'll give them credit. It does play like an actual fucking game. This is one of the best conversions of a pre-existing game into VR, and for that at least, it is somewhat impressive. But I gotta be honest about something. When I was a wee lad playing Tony Hawk's Underground 2, I got myself into a situation where the camera kept changing perspective, and it was the first time in my life where I'd really felt the effects of motion sickness in a video game. Usually I'm fairly unaffected. I find things like motion blur in games to be a little bit distracting, but when it's done well, it doesn't bother me at all. And it usually doesn't make me feel outright sick. I can't look down in cars, real ones, that is, for very long. That does get to me. So I want it to mean something when I say this properly. DRIVECLUB VR is easily the most motion sick I've ever felt in my life. Planes, boats, nada. This is it. This is the absolute fucking peak. I could only go playing this thing for a few minutes at a time, and my god did I feel it. Despite me and the obvious bias that comes along with that, I still think the experience is a bit fucking scuffed. The windscreen doesn't seem to be rendered properly, and the adjustable driving positions never really seem to fit. My head's either bouncing off the roof, or I'm barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel. Actually, no, that's probably accurate. There is no easy way to say that this is just an uncomfortable experience. But once again, even though the bikes was a much better expansion, they did put in an actual effort. God, I best get that looked at. The PlayStation VR is terrible. It's cheaply made, it's under-designed, and I don't think it was made for someone with a nose as big as mine. That being said, it's hard to imagine the last one guy working at Evo trying to get this fucking thing out the door. For whatever it's worth, I don't blame them. I blame this piece of shit. It's time for aesthetics. Beginning this trio of elements is the music. DRIVECLUB, of course, is an intense racing experience, but it does have more casual feeling moments. To find a soundtrack to suit that is fairly difficult and would take a lot of time. Instead of a curated track list, it was decided this was to be scored, and that score would be composed by Welsh electronic outfit Hybrid. They themselves already had experience specifically composing 4 video games, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon and Future Soldier. What ended up being created was the almost exact same principle of Motorstorm Apocalypse. The principle is that there are only a handful of tracks composed for the score, and despite the number, all of which are very distinct. The second aspect of the principle is that numerous artists step in to then remix said music. It's certainly an interesting idea, and the remixes themselves do a really good job of setting themselves apart. Motorstorm Apocalypse did seem to split off in more wildly different directions, where songs ended up feeling almost entirely different, but what DRIVECLUB has is variety. Orchestral, house, trance, dubstep, drum and bass, and even vocals added upon each mix. There's a huge amount of variety going on here. Sound can certainly be progressive, vacillating perfectly between the active scrambling of the races and the ambient downtime of the menus. No matter what, the soundtrack is always amping for whatever comes next. It's reiterative, not derivative. The list of tracks in-game is extensive, and many of the artists who have stepped in to take part in these remixes are no stranger to racing games in general. Some tracks sound like unabashed club boppers, and then in other places it reminds me of Jack Wall's excellent Call of Duty Black Ops 2 soundtrack. There's a freedom and an openness to the music that makes the experience of playing the game much more well-rounded. Surprisingly, by default, it's set to off in races, or at the very least mixed very low. Audio does take precedence, and it does make a lot of sense, as the quality in that particular regard is certainly of a very high standard. Despite that, the music fits the pace and tone of the game very well. But what about some personalized choices? Songs that fit the experience, while perhaps dictating a little of their own as well. Blizzard by Kavinsky opens with an infectious kick and leads to a beautiful breakdown. That's to say nothing of the excellent sampling throughout the track. Disciples by Tame Impala is a clear as day example of short and sweet, feeling both classic and modern, with a gorgeous instrumental to boot. Hell of a Life by Kanye West might certainly be an oddball pick, but the tone and overall power perfectly fit the game. With his trademark characterization and the heaviest of bass within the verse breaks, it most definitely fit my experience. To circle back around to the game's score one last time, I think it's a solid effort. The music assists the emotion, and that's all I could ever ask for. Its variety, its coolness makes booting up the game a treat every time. It's slick, enjoyable, and the game simply wouldn't be the same without it. Wherever the developers thought the precedent laid within gameplay, it fits the experience beautifully. Audio! Masterfully done. DRIVECLUB's presentation continues in the direction of stellar, with both little and large always being accounted for, even being able to adjust specific aspects including environment and collision and AI. It's dense and impressive. When it comes to sound in this game, it's all about effort. Effort that most notably went into actually recording these vehicles, using the real-world equivalents and adjusting them to be as rich as possible. Recording from multiple angles, so the in-game internal and external audio are completely different. It's a lot of work, but maron has it paid off. The broad differences between the variety of all the vehicles is even more staggering. It even works towards the gameplay's favor in certain aspects. Leaving the track and hitting the dirt is weirdly loud. It's a painful reminder of player failure. And they by no means purely stopped with interaction. The growling of distant storms sets an unmistakable mood. And tunnels be scary. The ambient details are unique and fitting for each environment. Nothing's left out, nothing's unaccounted for. Everything's so well Hey, wait a minute, I recognize that noise. All of this goes without saying, the DRIVECLUB sounds good. Real. Whether it's the vicious roar of an overtuned engine, or the calm whisper of the sea breeze. Those cold sea waves might be the best introduction I could possibly give to the final aspect of the aesthetics in DRIVECLUB. Because, god damn! A year into the PS4's life cycle, and Evolution decides to lay down the mother of all fucking gauntlets when it comes to looks. There are no two ways about it, this game's a fucking peach. The PlayStation 3 and the generation it was more broadly attached to had one big problem when it came to muted color palettes. Whilst the grain and the gloom certainly fit Nico Bellic's story in a place like Liberty City, the industry did seem to become somewhat crowded with this visual idea. MotorStorm as a series was consistently beautiful, and its color palette was also consistently muted. A Tropical Paradise was fittingly green and blue, but under MotorStorm's surface there was always a feeling of tension and violence. There was always something wicked just below the surface. And whilst Arctic Edge may have bucked that trend slightly, the usage of color in the MotorStorm series was often sparing and fitting. I don't wish to remark so much on the past, but it's worth noting that DRIVECLUB is a completely different game, a completely different series, and yet, they've done it better than almost anybody. I've already revolved the idea of the introduction level of this game being a considerable deep end to drop the player into. This was of course in mechanics, but it also applies perfectly to the aesthetic. The big reason for why that is, and probably the only one that would ever matter, is that there's so little to criticize. I don't want this to be as shameless as me drunkenly hitting on a girl at a bar. Instead, I want it to be a consideration of craft. Blowing disc brakes or floating confetti. Detail is key, but to speak larger, it's a close race between the vehicles and the environments for which one is more bowled over beautiful. Heavy saturation and a noticeable vibrancy everywhere. The game, if nothing else, is always fun to look at. To begin with the environments, each country stands alone. The cultures are distinct and iconic without feeling predictable or relying on stereotypes. India may have large elephant statues, but it also has luscious farmland. Chile might have its expansive salt flats, but it also has its handmade villages. The iconography is apt, and there's a level of respect given to the finer details of these countries that make them feel a lot more nuanced. The countries themselves have their own aesthetic identity, and one way this is helped is by having each country adhere to their own particular colours. Scotland conveys a fairly harsh image, with its muted green grass growing atop the ancient rocks. There's an occasional splash of colour with things like flowers and the buildings, but for the most part this is a darker environment, as it should be. Japan, on the opposite end, is drenched in colour, defined by soft pastel pinks and visually loud reds. Because of course, how could they make Japan without a cherry blossom and a Torii gate? Despite both of these countries being somewhat mountainous in places, they don't look at all the same. It's a polish that isn't usually seen in games, and when that camera flies over a valley, it's clear that their passion for these environments has really shone through. There are some noticeable fade-outs between the camera angles, but when the game looks this good, who even cares? Whilst the tracks are certainly linear, the illusion of a larger world beyond those borders is very well defined. Drifting atop a mountain, or charging through a wooded valley, the elevation in DRIVECLUB is all over the place, and the game is all the more better for it, especially when it comes with variety. That stuff is broad and interesting, but it's the outside track details that really give these environments a sense of belonging. Stopping at almost any corner in DRIVECLUB will give the player something to look at. It's not a particularly complex science, but it's always effective. Is this a racing game or some kind of walking simulator about an old fisherman named Harold, whose wife has just left him and he's taken to day drinking and talking to himself in prose? I feel for you, Harold. And all these little touches, the houses, the castles, even the fucking ski lifts, just make the world feel so much more alive. Like there's a story to each place and a history. I think it's something that most racing games just don't bother thinking about. And the framing of these areas only makes them feel more special. Seeing the elongated shadows stretch further and further in the faster time settings is always a treat to behold. But when the rain or even, the snow kicks in, the world changes once again. Slicking tarmac and the forked lightning, not to mention the fucking monsoon dunked on top of the player. It grounds everything in such a fun way. And of course then there is night, where the game is almost as frightening as it is gorgeous. It's perfectly fitting for the gameplay, but these environments change almost entirely at night. Seeing that nocturnal cityscape in Canada for the first time is frankly excellent. Even if the track itself doesn't play all that differently to any of the rest, the environment looks different enough that probably won't be noticed anyway. The world is so sprightly and diverse that every race feels different no matter what. From sunrise to sundown, there isn't a single area in this game that doesn't change. The bar is set impressively high, and then the machines come along to set it even higher. Every vehicle is given so much love and attention. Using CAD data to model each vehicle specifically, and it's no surprise just how well these have turned out, with every separate material being immaculately rendered and every tire being branded to a DRIVECLUB precision. I am by no means a car guy, as I am no longer 10 years old, but I gotta admit, it's impossible not to appreciate the details here. Every single one is designed with such a love and an authenticity that could only be done by someone who cares. The interiors are damn near perfect. Every little AC knob and fucking cup holders, they're all just modeled perfectly. And that's very obvious, sure, but this is literally just the interior of a Volkswagen Golf. If I squint hard enough at that fucking glove compartment, I'm pretty sure I can see my crack-cased Daft Punk Discovery CD in there. Like, holy shit! How much work was this? Nothing is a guess, it's all just fucking dead on. And it's even more ridiculous, because there are some cars in this game that are effectively fucking fictional, and they could have lied about the detail, but somehow they didn't? They took it all seriously? Why? They could have gotten away with it and I wouldn't fucking noticed. I'm a drunk idiot. Animated reactive spoilers and flaps. It's so much detail. This has to be about as close as it could be to owning one of these fucking things. $1 million? Or one video game? Come on! Feels like I'm taking advantage now. I just feel kind of weird. I feel bad for bashing these things around now, and it's not just a sense of personal shame, it's also a sense of regret. Oh yeah, the damage model's pretty good. It's no burnout, but it doesn't need to be. It's pretty realistic, and it's convincing. I definitely saw it a lot. The reflections are accurate, and they always situate the car in its environment. And the windscreen wipers. How did they even do that? The rain droplets move, and there's a smear left on the windscreen, and the raindrops even have inertia. God, this hurts to think about. It's not even like they delayed a game, it's like they delayed the fucking moon landing or something. Shit. Every facet of the game just has so much polish. The UI is gorgeous and perfectly unintrusive. And the event tickets. Oh, they're so fucking cool. Delivering the necessary information, whilst letting loose and being a bit more creative than most games. I'm not a huge fan of the custom artwork. I can't seem to shake off the feeling like I'm trying to touch up the girl with the pearl earring or some shit. Try as I might, I think I'll make the cars look like shit. Well, I'm not winning any prettiness awards, but I do respect the choice. And there is no Ford GT in this game, so I did have to, improvise. And for whatever my aesthetic flaws, the game knows it's pretty. And they let the player appreciate that fact with multiple camera angles and things like filters in the camera settings. Add in some film grain and a nice color filter, and being able to actually play that just makes the game feel a lot more free. like they're not afraid for the player to play it how they want. There's even a slight jab at the previous generation with one of the filters, and yeah, I think that kind of proves my previous point. And much like everything else in this game, another feature that they haven't half-assed are the replays. An absolute considered feature in this game, and it's always nice to just breathe in the atmosphere a little bit. The system is simple and easy to navigate, and it's exactly what I'd asked for. The replays are impressive, and they're given just enough attention to keep them interesting. And that leads me to one of the best photo modes I've ever seen. F-stops, exposure, focal distances, shutter speed, film grain, even fucking bokeh shape. Like, what the fuck did they need to go to this much effort for? Carefully crafting an image, or just taking a nice shot? For someone who doesn't know anything about cameras, I can imagine this shit being real fucking overwhelming at the beginning. But the system doesn't need to be complicated necessarily. There's an autofocus system, so in, out, nice moment captured. But if the deeper experience is wanted, this is print, photo frame, next to the missus kinda beautiful. I love photo modes in games, mainly just to fuck around. And here, it's not only accepted, but encouraged. The photo mode, bizarrely enough, did actually make me consider something that I hadn't previously about the visuals of this game. The game is beautiful, no doubt, but it kind of looks better than reality. And when thinking about the photo mode, I realized that's no accident. The game's achieving its look not by simulating the human eye, but by simulating a camera. And that leads nicely to my final point, all the graphical fidelity and the praise it rightfully deserves. The artistic direction is impeccable. That is no surprise after Motorstorm, but for what this game is, it's absolutely staggering. Some rare racing games, and I would consider Motorstorm a part of this, find a way to become aesthetic wonders, achieving not only a strong visual identity, but the feeling of it too. It's not that it isn't a showcase of technology, it's that it's a declaration of talent and, well, craft. The aesthetics excel from every vector of approach, and for that, DRIVECLUB is simply a vibe. At the beginning of this sojourn, however long ago that was, I said the game was, for good reasons, misleading. But not because of the game itself, but rather the perception towards it. Because the team made very clear what this game was from its beginning, an authentically detailed social racing experience. This was, of course, around a time when something of that description would be considered vague and ultimately uninteresting. There was also a trend around this time of putting visuals before gameplay, and looking at a game like DRIVECLUB that looks as good as it does, it would be very easy to consider that it was one of those games that had put visuals before gameplay. But DRIVECLUB beat that trend. The developers had a palpable commitment to their idea. One of the reasons it does work so well is because the game takes itself seriously in all the best places, keeping the experience light enough, even at its most difficult. Appealing so broadly usually ends in disaster, but they honestly pull it off. It's intuitively designed and always throwing new things at the player. But what really defines DRIVECLUB is what's below the surface, what's waiting to be discovered and loved. Is it the broadness of an entire vehicle class, or the specificity of one particular corner? The reason it all comes together is because they never asked the player to choose. I consider the game to be an unreserved success, and I will actually admit, the first time I played DRIVECLUB, I didn't click with it right away. It took a while. One day I turned on the game just wondering if I missed something. And of all the games I've played, DRIVECLUB might be the one that I've never been more wrong about initially. The love I have for this game has only grown over the years, and it will only continue to do so. But I am one person. I'm not a community, and a community couldn't even stop what happened. DRIVECLUB had a particularly rough launch, as already discussed, and at the time, a year into the console generation when there had already been numerous delays, it did cause a bit of a bloody nose when it came to the console wars. From some of the parties involved, it does seem that Sony gave Evo a fair amount of leeway. And as unshakable as the bad launch may have seemed, over the next year and a little beyond, this team clawed their way up to the top. Not once was this game ever given up on by the people who made it. On March 23rd, 2015, a few months after the game's release, half the studio was sacked. And whilst this didn't seem to slow the team down too much with updates, one day off a year to the day, on March 22nd, 2016, the studio altogether was shut down. DRIVECLUB VR released in October of 2016, technically making it the last game released by Evolution. The loss is irrefutably heavy, not most notably for the field they were involved in, or the industry as a whole, but because this is people's lives. People who put countless hours of work and care and attention only to be shafted. It certainly had ripples, and even though racing games are their own particular niche, it seemed like just a moment everybody was paying attention to this little Runcorn developer. But despite the indignant tone of all these journalists who felt the need to kick a developer while they were down, suddenly they were very upset. Because it didn't matter. The pigs had been cooked. It was done. Sony had made their decision. But I am one guy. I don't need to be polite. Sony, expecting a success, or even game, comparable to Gran Turismo, was not only misguided, but fucking stupid and patently unfair. They're a perfectly shitty company, and if they were happy enough to kill the King of Pop just for the fucking Beatles records, they're not gonna feel too bad about taking out another developer. So that means the only racing game left on this fucking platform is Gran Turismo. No Wipeout, no Twisted Metal, no Motorstorm, and now no DRIVECLUB. So across the barren fucking wasteland that is PS4 exclusives, pretty fucking ironic that amidst the sea of all these third-person shooters, easily the best game came from what Sony once called their worst developer. That's pretty fucking funny. After the fall, Evolution in Parts was picked up by Codemasters, saving this developer at a very difficult time and morphing them to what later became Codemasters Evo. But that is a story for another day. In retrospect, it's very easy to embrace the game, and plenty have. But with a pillar of design, that being the multiplayer being gone, the game isn't so much the awkward position, the circumstances. With as good as DRIVECLUB is, it's hard to not consider how strong it would have eventually been. It's a fascinating question, and unfortunately one that's unlikely to be answered. But this game is fantastic. It's a testament to one of racing's best developers. It's precise, fun, and chipping away never felt so good. The legacy of this game will continue to live on, and hopefully, not just because of what it could have been, but by what it is. Not merely another product, but rather the careful construction of what a video game should be. Enjoyable from minute one to the hundreds of hours later. DRIVECLUB doesn't so much reinvent the wheel as it simply perfects the curve. High beams behind, and there's still time to close the distance, for the journey is all but finished. Tarmac ahead drifts away, road markings flickering into a warning. Beneath the shade, above the tide, the gauge climbs further and the road ahead turns to an amorphous stream of colors. The ghosts in each corner and the burnt rubber painted atop the slickened cobble. No matter how far, no matter how faded, the memories remain within the fabric of these winding alleyways. Our time was brief yet enchanted in the retrospect. Only in the flick of the steering wheel is that ever close to being forgotten. We'll hold each other in the color before the tunnel robs the light. As this Wayfarer's day is done, one last call for the last loss.
Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate, celebrate and dance so free. One more time. Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate, celebrate and dance so free.